Hello, everyone. Welcome to the main installment of our VSA webinar series, which comes to you from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and addresses topics related to the arts and special education. I am Emily Thiel, the coordinator of special education here at the center, and I will be your webinar moderator. Today's webinar is called Developing 21st Century Skills in UDL, Arts Integrated Group Learning Using Task Sheets and Rubrics. If you would like to view live stream captioning of this webinar, you can follow the link you see on this slide and in the chat box of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Before we get going, I'd like to take a brief moment and introduce you to the Cisco WebEx Event Center. Broadcast messages from the Kennedy Center team, such as the link for live stream captioning, appear in the chat box, which you can select from the control panel on the top right of your window. If you need to leave the webinar early, you can leave it by clicking on the X in the upper left corner. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you can catch up on any parts you miss. You can connect to the audio portion of the webinar through your telephone or through your computer's microphone and speakers. Select the option that works best for you. If you are using your telephone, please make sure to mute your computer speakers. You could submit comments, questions, or answers to questions using the Q&A option, which you can select from the top panel. Please note that this is different than the chat box and allows moderators to view your questions. Please make sure that your question is directed to all panelists. I'll monitor this screen throughout the webinar. If you prefer to speak your input rather than typing it, please click on the Raise Your Hand icon, which can be found in your view on the participants panel. I will touch base with you and unmute your microphone at the appropriate time. Much of today's presentation will be conducted over a screen share. If you would like to adjust your view by zooming in or zooming out, you may click on the magnifying glasses. You may also expand your view to full screen. At the end of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions about the material. During this open-ended question and answer time, please raise your hand if you wish to speak or type your question into the Q&A box. Within the week, we will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and a copy of the webinar transcript. This means that you can go back and watch the recording and review supplemental materials in addition to any notes you take during the webinar itself. Next month, we will present a Voices from the Field series, Hot Topics, Cool Tools, Technology for Students with Disabilities in the Arts, presented by Celia Hughes. Each Tuesday over the course of June, we'll present a 15-minute lightning talk that addresses this important theme in our field. Our first lightning talk will take place on Tuesday, June 5th at 12:30 p.m. The registration link can be found in your chat panel. If you're active in social media, I invite you to connect with us using hashtag VSAWebinar. On Facebook, we are VSA International, and on Twitter, we are VSAINTL. We would love to engage with you. And with that, I hand it over to today's presenter, Helene.
Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So today we're going to explore some questions in using task sheets and rubrics. So some of the questions I want us to explore and see after the presentation what your understanding of it is why small group projects for arts integrated learning experiences? Why do teachers and teaching artists often implement individual art or art integrated learning experiences? What is the difference between arts enhancement and arts integration? And how can we design rubrics that document growth in art concepts and skills as well as academic concepts and skills?
Helene, I apologize to interrupt, but we actually can't see your PowerPoint. Do you mind trying to reshare your screen?
Oh, let's see. How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. So what is the difference between arts enhancement and arts integration? How can we facilitate students' creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and self-efficacy by ensuring they experience all phases of the artistic creative process and self-manage their learning in small groups? Also, how can we apply UDL Guidelines 6, 8, and 9 to provide options for executive functions, provide options for sustaining effort and persistence, and provide options for self-regulation to facilitate successful small group arts-integrated learning experiences through the use of student task sheets and student rubrics? What do these types of student task sheets and student rubrics for small arts-integrated learning include? So to start off, a little bit of a why behind this is the connection of applied behavioral analysis and arts integration. This is where I came up with the idea of developing, using task analysis to develop student task sheets. Applied behavioral analysis comes from, it's a scientific approach that tries to determine the function of behaviors or the why students are doing what they're doing. Some of the different skills within applied behavioral analysis is one of the things is a task analysis. One of the things that I've applied from it, and that is taking a complex skill and just breaking it down into a sequential step or task. Self-management also is an important concept in ABA, and that is teaching behavior change techniques so that children or adults can facilitate strong internal locus of control. Under self-management, there's different ways to do this. Self-instruction, using something to have students self-instruct themselves, using tools to have students self-monitor and tracking their own behavior so they can make choices to discontinue their off-task behavior. And then self-evaluation, where they're talking about and evaluating their own behavior or work so that they can set goals and realistic expectations. Self-reinforcement is the other aspect of self-management, and that's where they choose from different reinforcement opportunities. So connecting applied behavioral analysis and arts integration, students who often have challenges in learning, self-management, developing their self-management skills in general has shown to be really beneficial. So how can we do this when we're implementing arts integration learning? What are some pedagogies that can help with that? The other thing I did was say, in addition to creating self-instruction, self-monitoring student task sheets that will help increase that, if we connect these steps that we create on these task sheets to the phases of the artistic creative process, then we can also use these task sheets as a self-monitoring tool in ensuring that the students are really going through all of the phases of the creative process. And as mentioned before, when we're increasing student self-management skills and using tools, we are looking at UDL Guidelines, our Universal Design for Learning Guidelines, and helping them increase in providing options for executive functioning, providing options for recruiting interest, and providing options for sustaining effort and persistence as well as regulation. And so these are all things that we're able to do by incorporating task sheets and rubrics. Some work that I've done with this, some research I've done this, was using, looking at arts integration on K through second graders and development of their 21st century skills, which is creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. In summary, there were significant gains found when arts integration was implemented using task sheets and rubrics, and the results were, of course, related to the interventionist that was doing it and the fidelity of implementation that they were using that for. So when we're looking at the why do we create student task sheets and rubrics, as we mentioned, to facilitate student self-management skills. As we've mentioned before, self-instruction and self-regulation with student task sheets, and self-evaluation with student rubrics. We also increase student self-efficacy as they realize that they are capable of engaging and completing their work and monitoring their progress. And then also, as mentioned, to go through all phases of the artistic creative process, oftentimes implementing arts integration or arts education, arts activities in a classroom. Students often create and often could skip the reflect revise phase. And we know that's really important to increase their critical thinking. And so we need to think of ways to engage them in going through that process. And then lastly, as mentioned, to increase their 21st century skills, as that's an area that all of our children need to increase with. The other reason is to increase students' vocabulary. Students' use of their vocabulary in arts integrated learning, their vocabulary for the art concepts and skills, and the academic concepts and skills. So when we create the student task sheets and rubrics, we're having the students constantly be thinking about these specific concepts and skills that we want them to be able to explain about their art, so they're seeing it over and over again. So how do we create these task sheets and rubrics? A student task sheet, again, coming from the concept of a task analysis, we'd want to make sure that we have each step of the process that the groups need to complete so that they're ready to share their product and performance with the class. Each step on the task sheet, we'd want to make sure that we align it to one of the phases of the artistic creative process, and even use those words, the verbs from the phases, to guide you for each step. Make sure that students are guided to reflect, revise their art based on the rubric criteria, and that's really important so they are ready to share and explain how their art demonstrates those concepts. And that's the key. The reflect phase not being that they have to look at their work and revise it from an aesthetically pleasing perspective. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Is there something they want to change? But most importantly, to reflect, and are they ready to explain how they used specific art concepts or skills to communicate the academic concepts that we want them to, that they're communicating through their art. And for student rubrics, we need to make sure that we actually include the art and academic vocabulary, which would be the concepts and skills that you want the students to explain, how their art illustrates them, and making sure we have those embedded within the rubrics. And then also write the criteria so that they are quantifiable, meaning that the students can specifically determine at what level their art would be at, how many, and we'll look at some. So let's look at an example of a task sheet, an example of a rubric. Here is one that one of my teacher candidates created. The goal was written at the top, the goal so that the students could understand what the purpose of the activity was. And then as you see, the phases of the artistic creative process that we went over earlier, she put those in bold. And in having the students examine, she wanted them to examine different animals and characteristics in their given animal group using their animal classification sheet. So she was having them engage there in the academic concepts that she wanted them to look over and understand. And then she wanted them to explore, and this looks like she was integrating dance, explore some specific dance vocabulary that she wanted them to think about in what they were going to incorporate into their dance to represent their animal. And she asked them to experiment with their ideas of what they were coming up with using these different dance vocabularies. And then after they've had all these ideas and a chance to explore, then she says, now create your 16-count dance that communicates 3 characteristics of your animal group. So notice there she's combining their academic concepts she wanted them to demonstrate as well as the dance vocabulary. Then she tells them to reflect and revise the dance using the rubric given. The share phase is not on here. I believe that was on another page, but the last phase would be a share phase on here where the students are explaining their art. The corresponding rubric for that was, this is the rubric the students used. So during their reflect revise phase, as you notice, they were directed back to look at their rubric. And on the rubric, we should see a nice correlation between, as we mentioned, does she have included the dance concepts, or her art form was dance, her dance concepts, and her academic concepts clearly as criteria on the rubric, what she wanted them to be able to explain and communicate through the art. And also, as we said in a rubric, how do we do it? And did she write this so that the students could clearly quantify it or distinguish between the different levels? So here she had asked them a 16-count dance or beats, and so here she's quantified that out. Here's her academic. She wanted them to have characteristics, so she had said 3, and then she quantified that out. And then further down, we see that she moves into body, and she had asked them to use 3 different body groups, and she quantified, and then movement, the 3 different movements. So these were the dance that she wanted them to be able to use, and think about how they wanted to use in their dance, and then how they were going to use that to communicate these characteristics. So let's look at what I want you to do now is think about, in your setting, imagine how you would create a task analysis for an arts integrated, arts enhanced, or even just an arts activity, and how you would write these steps sequentially. What specific academic or art concepts and skills, or both, would you expect students to be able to demonstrate and explain through their art? Explore different ideas. What might you have the students do at the imagine, examine, perceive step, and at the explore step, so that they're fully prepared to enter the create phase? What things would be important to have them imagine? What things would be important for them to explore during those steps before you actually ask them to create? And then create a student task sheet aligned to these phases. When you create it, how would you use picture cues? Maybe fewer words, larger font as needed to make it developmentally appropriate for the children or the youth that you have based on their developmental level. How would you actually format those student task sheets to make sure that they are able to be used by all of the individuals? And then reflect and to make sure that all of your steps are aligned to phases of the creative process, especially that the reflect revise phase directs students to use their rubric to be sure they're ready to explain their art by making any final revisions to their art or in their explanation of their art. Compare what you're thinking of to the exemplar. And again, one thing in practice that we find is unless we're using techniques to make sure that students are getting cues to, okay, we have this many minutes left and you should be on the reflect phase. Students oftentimes will not go and look at their rubric and practice and make sure they're able to really think, okay, I was using this locomotor movement to demonstrate this characteristic of this animal, and really be ready to be able to explain their art to the audience. And that's really important for their success in that, and also their critical thinking. And then if you can think about what are some ideas that you have, I'd love for you to share how you might, some of your ideas, how you could apply this to your specific art context and setting. And if you could think of that and type those in as those come into your mind, and then I'll ask some of you to share those later. And then I'm going to give you a little brainstorming activity, the same thing for rubric. And so hopefully some of you will have some ideas on how you would do this. So along perhaps with this idea you have for the task sheet, or maybe it'd be a different idea, imagine a rubric, a student rubric that you could develop for a specific task sheet. How would you include criteria for academic and art concepts and skills, or perhaps it's just art concepts and skills, depending on your setting, that you expect the students to be able to discuss about their art, product, or performance? How would you write the criteria so that the levels of success, you could quantify those across the 3 levels? How would you write them so the students who are using them could specifically count how many of the indicators they've included so they can self-evaluate their art? And this is so important because if they're not written so that students, if they're not quantifiable, then students can't use the rubrics to actually self-evaluate. And remember, the point of it is to help them increase in their self-management skills. And self-evaluation is one of that. So this is why it's real important that we make sure that they're able, that students can actually count how many indicators they have. And then how would you create a rubric so that it's developmentally appropriate, using fewer words perhaps, larger font, maybe picture clues? And then reflect on your rubric. You could look back at the rubric exemplar. Is there an equal emphasis, if you're doing arts integration, on art and academic concepts and skills, and that the levels are quantifiable? And then again, these ideas that you have, how might you take this and use this skill in your context and setting? If you're having some ideas pop in your head, please jot those down, and we'll have Emily open that up in just a little minute. So as we think about this, going back, and here's where I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Why should small group projects be, why are they important for arts integrated or even arts learning experiences? Why often do teachers or teaching artists implement individual art activities or art integrated activities? Any thoughts on that?
Right now, our audience is a little quiet. They might be absorbing all of the wonderful information you're passing along.
Okay. What is the difference between arts enhancement and arts integration? And how can we design the rubrics that can document this growth to distinguish the difference between? Again, the task sheets. How can we make sure that we're using those task sheets to help students go through all phases of the creative process? And then how are we applying the UDL guidelines to provide, so that we can provide options for children's executive functions to help them sustain effort and persistence and for self-regulation? Why is this important in small group arts integrated learning experiences? And how do we do that when we use student task sheets and student rubrics? How does that help with that?
We're starting to have some feedback trickle in.
Okay.
And I'd love to share it with you. The first one is that I think with the smaller groups, it gives us a chance for our teachers to have more one-on-one time with their students. They really need that one-on-one time to help them focus and make sure that they have direct engagement.
Good.
And then another one was small group skills are important because they can challenge each other, my areas in the theater arts.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's like helps to facilitate even more the creative process where they can challenge each other's imaginations and often get ideas. That's very good.
Another person mentioned, for your first question, students may respond better in small groups because it's a less overwhelming experience. Also, this is an easier way to monitor what students are actually grasping.
Yes. And for that participant that shared, would they mind sharing what they have experienced with that, with their small group?
Yeah, I'll give them a minute to type in their response. In the meantime, another person shared some thoughts. It says, I think in the smaller groups too, that students are more likely to take on leadership roles versus when they are in a larger group. And another attendee says, small groups allow students to interact with their peers more, and they seem to enjoy that.
So back to the question, yes, all of these are very, very true and very important. I'm curious to see if anyone has any thoughts on, these are all very important reasons of why small group is important. Then the second question, why often do we see that a lot of times teachers will implement individual, if they're doing any kind of art activity in their classroom or art integrated activity, a lot of times they tend to lean towards individual instead of group, small group. Are there any thoughts on that, since we're hearing a lot of important reasons why small group is needed? And then also I would love to hear, going back to our activity earlier, if any ideas people have on how they might implement using student task sheets and student rubrics in their setting.
One individual shared that they feel like teachers may feel like they have better control with individual engagement versus in a small group.
That's often the case, of feeling overwhelmed, sometimes behavior like this person just mentioned of the how students are engaged. So again, the point of having these student task sheets, children are really engaged in being able to monitor their own progress. So having the task sheet, having the students, if it's written so the student's developmentally appropriate and they can use it, then the students should be monitoring where they're at. The teacher should only have to give time cues, you know, and how much time they have left, and they should be moving towards working on the explore phase or the create phase, and then students are managing their own progress through it. And it really helps because that's increasing their self-management. So otherwise, you have a lot of teacher this or, you know, artist this, lots of questions, lots of constant needing direct teacher attention without the use of something where they can manage their own learning. So that's a good point. Was there any? Yeah, go ahead.
We have a few more thoughts I think you might enjoy. So one says that individual engagement allows for more personal, creative exploration and reflection, so it gives students a chance for more independent learning. And another one was teachers may only offer arts-related activities to students that they consider artistic.
Yeah, that's true. Which is that's an interesting point, because when we implement an arts integrated activity or an arts activity, one of the things that I always make sure my teacher candidates know is it needs to be implemented with multiple means of action and engagement. If we're not offering a different choice in the art form of what they're creating and allowing them to choose a different art form to show what they're learning academically, then we need to make sure that we're at least providing choices in the mediums that they're going to use if it's visual art, or choices in, as this one was, the different options they might want to use in different types of movement or different types of using space differently. Because some students may not enjoy if every child is expected to be an actor in a drama integrated activity. That might actually cause problems with them. So how do we engage them in providing multiple roles within the group, or maybe one person is writing the script, one person is designing the costume or the backdrop, or maybe even the music behind the scenes or something like that. So that's a very good point, especially when we're talking about differentiated instruction for our learners with different abilities and interests.
Another bit of feedback in regards to your question of individual work. Some teachers may struggle or hesitate to assign group work because they want students to feel pride of ownership of artwork. And there may be a fear that group work could lessen that experience of, look what I made.
Oh, that's a great point. So what methods can we use to ensure that all of the members of the group are being recognized for their role? So this is real important, and also a sense of ownership within the group. And actually, this relates right back to what they are saying. The 21st century skills are lacking in our educational system in preparing our students for the real world and this collaboration, this communication. So how can we foster that teamwork in art activities or art integrated activities where each person has an important role that they're contributing and recognized for their role? So this is important in making sure that the roles are distinguished. Multi-arts activities, well, theater has that embedded within it, where there could be different roles assigned to that. And then that person in the group, when it's the share phase, they're explaining their part of it. I'm thinking of an activity I do in my course that our teacher candidates take in arts integration, where they put on a multi-arts performance, and each member in the group usually has a different role. And so after their performance and they're sharing about it, whoever designed the costumes or who designed the digital background scenery explains why they use certain art elements in their design and what they were trying to communicate. The actors will explain their acting, the musicians explain why they developed the music. So everybody has an important role and is getting that attention. So that's a really good point. I'm so glad that that participant brought that up.
Another person shared, individual engagement allows for more personal, creative exploration and reflection, and it gives students a chance for more independent learning, which we heard echoed a bit earlier as well, but just to build on that previous idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and oftentimes you'll hear, I mean, even my students, some of them really prefer and lean towards that individual. They want to create, they feel like they have more ability, freedom to explore anything they want if they're creating individually. And then when they're creating something with a group, there's that need to engage and explore everyone's ideas and be able to come together with an idea that works for the whole group. And the importance of both. I think is what is important, right? It shouldn't be one or the other, but the importance of implementing both really for the full growth, and which is probably, obviously it's a lot easier, right? So visual art tends to lean to be more individualized, and then performing arts usually more collaborative. So how can we think of those activities and creating opportunities where there is that ability to have the communication and collaboration, maybe even on a partner level, with if it's just a visual art activity or something. So we're providing both individual and collaborative creative experiences. And I think we should probably open it up for general questions, I'm guessing, looking at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have now reached the question and answer portion of our webinar. If you haven't already, now is the time to enter a question into the Q&A box or raise your hand. To get started, is there an age group you recommend beginning to use rubrics and task sheets with?
That's a very good question. I believe you can use this with any age group. I've used it and trained teachers anywhere from pre-K level all the way up to secondary. So I know that might be quite surprising for some of the attendees to hear that. But rubrics and task sheets, even if a child isn't reading yet, can be created and developed so that the children associate a picture symbol with what they're doing in that step, or a happy face, a so-so face, a sad face for the different levels on the rubric. And it can really engage them. I remember we did an arts integration project in a Title I school with pre-K classrooms, 8 of them, and they all had children with special needs. 4 of them were self-contained, and 4 of them were inclusion classrooms in pre-K. And consistently, the students who were developing the language the most and showed the most growth in their vocabulary were the ones that had the most challenges originally. And this was the teachers had not utilized the concept of rubrics with them in this, and they were really starting to use these at a very simple level, and the children were really using that to talk about their art. And they were really impressed with their growth in that, even for some children on the autism spectrum who were normally not verbal. So I encourage it for all levels.
Great, thank you. Why is quantifying levels in the rubric to gauge proficiency so important?
Good question. So quantifying is so that the students themselves can use the rubric themselves independently. If we just use words like I used all, or I can explain all, or I can explain some, or that is not specific. What all could mean one thing to one person and another thing to another person. So if, for example, we have listed out, maybe we wanted them to explain, if it was visual art, we wanted them to explain, we had 3 things we asked them as an artist to think about how they were going to use: line, color, and let's say value. And we wanted them to think about how they were using those to communicate the order of the solar system or something, whatever it was. If we write in the criteria, I can explain how I use line, color, and value to show different planets or whatever the academic piece was or whatever. Then in the quantifiable place, we've already listed out what we want them to be able to do. We've already have specific indicators there. And then all we have to do there is state how many, so that when the students are working, remember the reflect phase is for the students to go back and look at their rubrics and ask themselves and practice, can I explain this? Can I use all of this, and technically it's vocabulary, right? Can I use all of this art vocabulary? Can I use the academic vocabulary to actually explain my art? Without that, we won't see as much growth in their ability to actually show us that they really understood what we wanted them to understand, because the only way we can know that they know it is not by what they create, but it's what they explain about what they create. And that's why it's really important to have the language, the vocabulary concepts on there, and then to quantify that out so the students know what level, how many they can actually use when they're looking at their art to explain their art, and they're thinking about that when they're creating.
Do you recommend using rubrics to capture larger unit projects or smaller individual lessons?
That's a very good question. Both actually. I think the individual lessons, you can use this for individual lesson or activities that you're creating. You could also use this on a unit project where your task sheets would obviously be longer, because there would be more steps to them. It's going to encompass multiple days, maybe even weeks. And then your rubric would be your perhaps summative assessment for the end project of what they're creating. So that's an excellent question. And you can use them for both. They might look, one will be more complicated and more detailed than the other. And I've had some teachers where they like to take their unit project idea and then they'll create task sheets. Sometimes they'll create a very in-depth task sheet for the unit, and then other teachers like to create separate task sheets where they kind of break down at however many learning opportunities or learning days that they're having for it, and then use the rubric as their, what's the final outcome? What's the knowledge and skills that you're going to be able to explain in your art when you share it with the audience?
How do you help students in self-reflection that may struggle with being objective?
That's a very good question. I think that takes scaffolding. This is a skill, using a rubric, using a task sheet. Like anything, it's not something you can just expect them to know how to do and what the purpose of it is for. So you can create a task sheet on anything, coming into a classroom or, cleaning up routine or whatever, so get them used to what is the purpose of a task sheet. And the same thing for a rubric. What is the purpose of a rubric? One thing that I think helps a lot with that is introducing the concept to students of real world, making them understand. Most of them, depending on the children, they very well may not know what it means to critique art. And what is an art critic? What do they do? What does that look like in the real world? And then as an artist, how do we critique art, our art? How are we reflecting on it? And what's the point of reflecting on it? What's the point of feedback from the audience, feedback from myself, to reflect so that I can think about what I might change if I did this again, or what I might want to continue to revise, and what I'm ready to share to the audience. Did I communicate what I really wanted to communicate, right? Because it's all about communicating. And so just the idea of why does an artist create art? To communicate. How well is my art communicating what it's supposed to be communicating? And that's what the rubric is to help us for. It's to help us just self-evaluate and do that. And that takes scaffolding. It takes teacher cue or artist cue while children are working and reminding as they're working, and that's what the task sheet's good for, because it's a reminder, it's on the task sheet, that reflect revise phase and directing them to use their rubric to make sure they're ready and practice to share. And so it's, as anything, explaining the why and then making sure we are guiding them with cues as we're implementing the activities.
Another attendee asked, in addition to what you've shared today, can you recommend a good resource for additional example rubrics or task sheets? And you don't have to have an answer now. I'm happy to share it with attendees later. But
so this is something that I created, a method that I created. I have plenty that teacher candidates have developed, and also partner schools that we're beginning to work with here, with our partner schools that we're working with as they are, working. So if they contact me, I could pass on some to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helene. I'm going to take control back and conclude this webinar, but thank you very much. All right, so that concludes today's webinar. I'd like to ask you, our webinar participants, to keep your window open following the webinar, where a survey will generate on this screen. Your feedback is always appreciated. And thank you for joining us. For questions or comments, I can be reached by email at ectheal@kennedy-center.org or by phone at 202-416-8742. Have a nice day.